You've noticed in my book up here, we talk about white Christian nationalism. So it's in the title. Sometimes people talk about Christian nationalism. Other times we talk about white Christian nationalism. We are actually moving as a discipline to try to refer to white Christian nationalism rather than just blanket Christian nationalism. And I'll show you why. It actually operates very differently depending on whether or not you identify with one racial group or another. And this is because, and I'll indicate this to you in a second with some experimental data, religion in the United States is fundamentally racialized. So let me say that again. Religion in the United States is fundamentally racialized. It's shaped by our racial identities, and it's shaped by our racial experiences and our status in that social structure that we call race. Let me give you an example of how this works out with Christian nationalism research, though. So, this is the predicted percentage of white and black Americans who believe that whites face the most discrimination. So we asked Americans, we gave them a list of who experiences the most discrimination. Asian Americans, black Americans, white Americans, trans people, lesbian or gay Americans, Muslims, atheists. And this is the predicted percentage after we've controlled for all of these other factors: political partisanship, political ideology, education, where you live in the country. And so we looked at the score of Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism is across the bottom of the scale. And this is the predicted percentage. So again, after we have teased out all of these other controls. What we see is that as Christian nationalism increases, white Americans are basically in a linear fashion, become consistently more likely to say, yes, white Americans are the most discriminated against population in the United States. Now notice in this, let's look at the scale again. Do you see anything in there about race at all? Right? Not one question. Like, we don't even hint at it. We have no questions about race in our Christian nationalism scale, and yet, the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to believe that whites themselves are discriminated against. And yet, African Americans, black Americans, the more they affirm Christian nationalism, they don't do anything. They don't change at all in their attitudes. Why? Well, that would suggest that for white Americans, Christian language, Christian heritage, Christian values, Christian nation, that kind of language is fundamentally racialized. When they affirm those kinds of questions, it makes them think white. It makes them think people like us, people like me, my nation, my heritage, my kinds of values. Let me give you another example. Same pattern. This is the predicted percentage who agree with the statement, reports of police brutality are exaggerated by the media. We see as Christian nationalism increases, white Americans are basically, again, same pattern, linearly, more likely to say, you know what, the media exaggerates discrimination against black Americans. But black Americans hardly change at all as they affirm Christian nationalism. Why? Well, because for black Americans, that Christian language is not racialized the way it is for white Americans. It doesn't mean the same thing. Again, the language of Christianity, Christian identity, Christian values, Christian nation is racialized. Let me give you one more example. The predicted percentage of white and black Americans who agree that the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. So we're getting into a little bit of attitudes towards certain kinds of violence, permissible violence. We see as white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, they become increasingly more likely to say that, yes, best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. As black Americans increase, again, we don't see much change. This would all suggest that in the United States, Christian language is racialized. It means people like me, especially for white Americans. And when white Americans read that language, they think nostalgically. They look back to a time where people like me had the cultural power, had the political influence, and had the say, and they want to go back to that time. When black Americans affirm our measures of Christian nationalism, they don't think back to a time when the right people were in power and they had all the cultural influence and they had all the say. They don't think nostalgically. They tend to more think aspirationally, the kind of nation that we could be but never were, right? Like the kind of holding America to account for the values that it claimed to follow all along.